When Ruth Mackenzie stood before the towering Comanche warrior with her starving baby in her arms and offered him the only treasure she had left in this world, she had no way of knowing that her desperate plea would unravel secrets buried deeper than the Texas dust. Secrets that would shake the foundations of San Rafael and reveal the true cost of survival in a land where mercy was rarer than rain. The morning sun rose blood-red over the Texas plains, casting long shadows across the town of San Rafael like dark fingers reaching for something already lost. The air hung thick and still, carrying the scent of dry earth, mesquite smoke, and the faint metallic tang of the nearby Rio Seco, a river that had all but disappeared into cracked mud and exposed stone. It was late summer in 1867, and the land itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for relief that never came. Ruth Mackenzie walked slowly down the main street, her bare feet stirring small clouds of dust with each careful step. Her dress, once a respectable calico print of blue flowers, now hung from her frame like a burial shroud, faded to grey by sun and wear, patched at the elbows and hem with scraps that didn't match. The fabric clung to her gaunt body, revealing the sharp angles of collarbones and ribs that spoke of weeks without proper food. Her auburn hair, which had once been her pride, now hung in a loose, unwashed braid down her back, streaks of dust dulling its color to the shade of dried clay. But it was not her own condition that made the townspeople turn away as she passed. It was the bundle she carried against her chest, wrapped in a thin blanket that had once been white but was now the color of old smoke. Inside that blanket, pressed against Ruth's hollow chest, was Hazel, 18 months old, her tiny face pale as milk, her lips cracked and colorless. The child's eyes, once bright and curious, now stared with a glassy, unfocused gaze that saw nothing and everything at once. Her breathing came in shallow, irregular gasps, each one a labor that seemed too great for such a small body to bear. Ruth's arms trembled as she held her daughter, not from weakness alone, but from the terrible knowledge that time was running out. Hazel had not eaten in 2 days. Before that, it had been scraps, crusts of bread soaked in water, a spoonful of beans that Ruth had begged from the hotel kitchen. The child's belly, swollen and distended from malnutrition, pressed against Ruth's ribs like an accusation. Hazel no longer cried. She had stopped crying yesterday, and that silence was more terrifying than any scream. The town of San Rafael stretched before Ruth like a gauntlet she had no choice but to walk. Adobe buildings lined the street, their walls the color of sun-baked clay, their wooden porches sagging under the weight of too many dry seasons. Hitching posts stood at intervals, horses tied there, stamping their hooves and swishing their tails at flies. Men in wide-brimmed hats and dusty boots leaned against storefronts, their conversations dying as Ruth approached, their eyes sliding away from her as if poverty were a contagion they might catch. Women in bonnets and modest dresses gathered near the general store, baskets on their arms, their voices dropping to whispers as Ruth passed. She heard the words even when they thought she couldn't. Widow, shameful, ought to have family, should have gone back east. The words cut deeper than hunger, deeper than exhaustion. But Ruth kept her chin lifted, her spine straight. She had learned long ago that dignity was sometimes the only possession the world couldn't steal. Though it tried hard enough, in her right hand, clutched so tightly her knuckles had gone white, was a small leather pouch. Inside it rested her last treasure, the only thing of value she had left after everything else had been taken, sold, or lost. She had carried it for 3 days, debating with herself, arguing in the silent hours before dawn whether she could truly part with it. But this morning, when Hazel's breathing had grown so faint, Ruth had pressed her ear to the child's chest to make sure her heart still beat. The decision had been made. Ruth stopped first at the trading post, a squat building with a covered porch where goods were bought and sold, where trappers brought pelts and ranchers sold cattle. The owner, a thick-bellied man named Horace Pym, stood behind a counter stacked with canned goods, tools, and bolts of fabric. His face was ruddy from drink and sun, his mustache stained yellow from tobacco. He looked up as Ruth entered, and his expression shifted from mild curiosity to obvious discomfort. Ruth stepped forward, shifting Hazel's weight in her arms. The baby's head lolled against her shoulder, too weak to lift. Ruth reached into her pouch and pulled out her treasure, holding it up to the light streaming through the dusty window. It was a silver pocket watch, engraved with delicate scrollwork, its case polished to a soft gleam despite the years. It had belonged to her husband, Daniel Mackenzie, a Texas Ranger who had died 8 months ago in a Comanche raid near the Brazos River. The watch was the only thing of his she had kept, the only piece of him that remained. Her voice, when she spoke, was hoarse from disuse and dehydration, but she forced the words out with as much steadiness as she could muster. "Mr. Pym, I need to sell this. It's sterling silver, Swiss-made. My husband carried it for 10 years. It's worth $50 easy, but I'll take 20. I just need enough to buy food for my baby. She hasn't eaten in 2 days, sir. Please." Horace Pym barely glanced at the watch. He shook his head, his jowls wobbling, and waved a hand dismissively. "Can't help you, Mrs. Mackenzie. I got no use for a watch, and even if I did, I ain't got cash to spare. Times are hard for everyone. You'd best try elsewhere." Ruth's throat tightened, but she swallowed the lump forming there and nodded. She turned and walked back into the sunlight, her vision swimming with exhaustion and desperation. Hazel made a small, pitiful sound against her chest, and Ruth pressed her lips to the baby's hot forehead, whispering words that held no meaning but offered what little comfort she could give. She moved to the next establishment, a saloon that doubled as a boarding house. The proprietor, a hard-eyed woman named Constance Burke, stood sweeping the porch, her movements sharp and efficient. Ruth approached, holding out the watch once more, her voice breaking as she repeated her plea. "Ma'am, I need to sell this. My baby needs food. I'm not asking for charity, just a fair price. $20, please." Constance stopped sweeping and looked Ruth up and down, her gaze cold and assessing. She glanced at the watch, then at Hazel's pale, listless face, and her mouth pressed into a thin line. "You should have thought about that before you let yourself get into this state. A woman alone with a baby and no means is a fool, Mrs. Mackenzie. I run a business, not a charity house. Now move along before you drive away my customers." The rejection landed like a physical blow. Ruth stepped back, her legs shaking, and turned away. She blinked hard against the sting in her eyes, refusing to let tears fall. Tears would not feed Hazel. Tears would not save her. She tried the general store next, then the blacksmith, then the livery stable. Each time, she was met with the same response: discomfort, pity, refusal. Some were kinder in their words, some were crueler, but the result was always the same. No one would buy the watch. No one would help. San Rafael, it seemed, had no room for a starving widow and her dying child. By midday, the sun blazed overhead like a forge, turning the street into a furnace. Ruth's vision blurred, her legs threatening to give out beneath her. She leaned against a hitching post, cradling Hazel, and allowed herself a moment of despair so profound it felt like drowning. She had failed. She had nothing left to offer. No more places to go, no more words to beg with. Hazel's breathing had grown even shallower, each tiny inhale a struggle that might be her last. And then, from the far end of the street, came the sound of hoofbeats. Slow, measured, deliberate. Ruth looked up, squinting against the sun, and saw a figure riding toward the town on a massive roan horse. Even from a distance, the rider's size was evident. He sat tall in the saddle, his frame broad and powerful, his presence commanding attention without effort. As he drew closer, the townspeople began to notice. Conversations stopped. Men straightened from their lounging positions. Women clutched their baskets tighter and stepped back into doorways. There was a tension in the air now, a wariness that spread like wildfire through the street. Ruth felt it too, though she did not understand it yet. The rider entered the town, and Ruth saw him clearly for the first time. He was Comanche, that much was obvious from his dress and bearing. He wore buckskin leggings and a long tunic, decorated with intricate beadwork in patterns of red, blue, and white. His chest was bare beneath a leather vest, revealing skin the color of burnished copper, scarred in places from old wounds. His hair, black as a raven's wing, hung long and loose past his shoulders, a single eagle feather tied into a braid near his temple. But it was his size that struck Ruth most. He was enormous, taller than any man she had ever seen, his shoulders broad as an ox yoke, his arms thick with muscle that spoke of a lifetime of labor and battle. His face was angular and strong, with high cheekbones and a jaw carved from stone. A scar ran from his left temple down to his cheekbone, pale against his skin, a mark of survival. His eyes, dark and unreadable, swept across the street, taking in everything, missing nothing. The horse he rode was equally impressive, a roan stallion that stood at least 16 hands high, its coat a deep red-brown, its mane and tail dark as midnight. The animal moved with a grace that belied its size, responding to the slightest shift of its rider's weight. Slung across the horse's back were bundles wrapped in hides, supplies of some kind, and a rifle rested in a scabbard near the saddle. The Comanche rode slowly down the center of the street, his gaze forward, his expression betraying nothing. Men stepped aside as he passed, some out of respect, others out of fear. Ruth watched him approach, her heart pounding in her chest, though she could not have said why. There was something about him, something that felt both dangerous and strangely safe, like standing in the eye of a storm. He stopped his horse near the center of town, directly in front of the trading post. He dismounted in one smooth motion, his boots hitting the ground with a solid thud. He tied the reins to a post and turned, his gaze sweeping the street once more. And then, for just a moment, his eyes landed on Ruth. She stood frozen, hazel limp in her arms, the watch still clutched in her trembling hand. The Comanche's gaze held hers for a heartbeat too, and in that brief moment, Ruth felt as though he could see straight through her, past the dirt and desperation, past the exhaustion and fear down to the raw, desperate need that drove her. Then he turned and walked into the trading post, disappearing through the doorway. The street seemed to exhale, tension easing slightly, though not entirely. Ruth sagged against the hitching post, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She did not know why that brief moment of eye contact had affected her so deeply, but it had left her shaken in a way the morning's rejections had not. Inside the trading post, she could hear the low rumble of voices, Horace Pym's higher-pitched tones and the deeper, quieter voice of the Comanche. The conversation was brief, and within minutes the warrior emerged carrying a bundle of supplies, cornmeal, dried meat, a canteen. He tied the bundle to his horse, then paused, his hand resting on the saddle. Ruth did not plan what happened next. She did not think, did not weigh her options, or consider the consequences. Desperation moved her body before her mind could catch up. She pushed away from the hitching post and stumbled forward, crossing the dusty street toward the towering figure. Her legs shook with every step, her vision tunneling. But she kept moving until she stood before him. So close she had to tilt her head back to see his face. The Comanche turned, his dark eyes dropping to her, then to the bundle in her arms. Ruth saw his expression shift just slightly as he took in Hazel's pale, lifeless face, the child's labored breathing, the way Ruth's arms trembled with the effort of holding her. Ruth's voice came out as a whisper, cracked and desperate, but she forced the words out. Each one a prayer, a plea, a last hope flung into the void. Please, my baby hasn't eaten in 2 days. Take my last treasure. It's all I have. Just help her. Please. She held out the silver watch, her hand shaking so violently the chain clinked against the case. The sunlight caught the engraving, making it gleam, a small piece of beauty in a world that had forgotten what beauty meant. The Comanche looked at the watch, then back at Ruth, his expression unreadable. For a long moment he said nothing. The street was silent, every eye turned toward them, every breath held. Ruth felt the weight of the town's judgment, their curiosity, their scorn, but she did not care. All that mattered was the man standing before her and the dying child in her arms. Then, slowly, the The Comanche reached out. His hand was huge, scarred, calloused from years of hard living. But when his fingers closed around the watch, his touch was surprisingly gentle. He studied it for a moment, turning it over, tracing the engraving with his thumb. Then he looked back at Ruth, and when he spoke, his voice was deep and quiet, accented but clear. Who made her hungry? The question struck Ruth like a thunderclap. It was not what she had expected. Not why are you starving or where is your family, but who made her hungry? The words carried weight, a demand for truth, for accountability, for justice. And in that moment, Ruth understood that this man, this Comanche warrior who towered over her like a mountain, was offering her something more than food. He was offering her a chance to be heard. Ruth's throat closed, tears finally spilling over, hot and fast down her cheeks. Her voice broke as she spoke, the words tumbling out in a rush, raw and unfiltered. My husband's business partner? A man named Edgar Calloway. After my husband died, he took everything. The ranch, the cattle, the money. He said Daniel owed him debts I knew nothing about, said he had papers to prove it. When I challenged him, he had the sheriff run me out. Said if I didn't leave, he'd have me arrested for trespassing on his land. I had nowhere to go, no family, no money. I've been living in a shack on the edge of town, surviving on scraps. And now Hazel is dying, and no one will help us. Her voice broke entirely, sobs racking her thin frame. She bent over Hazel, her tears falling onto the baby's hot forehead, and she felt the last of her strength crumble. She had nothing left. No pride, no hope, no fight. She was empty. The Comanche stood silent, watching her. Then, without a word, he reached into the bundle tied to his horse and pulled out a strip of dried meat and a small pouch of cornmeal. He held them out to Ruth, pressing them into her free hand, his large fingers closing hers around the food. Ruth stared at the food, then up at him, disbelief and gratitude warring in her chest. She tried to speak, but no words came. The Comanche stepped back, his gaze steady, and spoke again, his voice low but firm. Feed her. Now? Ruth nodded, her hands shaking as she tore off a small piece of the dried meat and held it to Hazel's lips. The baby's mouth moved weakly, her tongue barely responsive, but slowly, painfully, she began to chew. Ruth's heart clenched as she watched, tears streaming down her face, as Hazel swallowed the first bite of food she'd had in days. The Comanche watched for a moment longer, then turned back to his horse. But before he mounted, he paused and looked back at Ruth, his expression unreadable. Where is this man now? Edgar Calloway. Ruth's breath hitched. She pointed toward the north end of town, where a large ranch house sat on a hill overlooking San Rafael, its whitewashed walls gleaming in the sun. He lives there. In the house that used to be mine. The Comanche's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as he followed her gesture. He said nothing, but Ruth saw something shift in his expression, a hardening, a resolve that sent a shiver down her spine. He untied his horse and swung into the saddle with effortless grace, the animal shifting beneath his weight. He looked down at Ruth one last time, and his voice, when it came, was quiet but carried the weight of a promise. You will not go hungry again. Then he turned his horse and rode north toward the hill, toward the ranch house, toward Edgar Calloway. The townspeople watched in silence, some with fear, others with curiosity, as the towering Comanche disappeared down the road, dust rising in his wake. Ruth stood in the middle of the street, Hazel in her arms, the food clutched in her hand, and for the first time in months, she felt something she thought she'd lost forever, hope. The ride to Calloway Ranch took Ohiteka less than 20 minutes. But in that time, the land itself seemed to shift around him, transforming from the dusty poverty of San Rafael into something altogether different. The road climbed steadily upward, winding through scrub oak and mesquite, the earth beneath his horse's hooves changing from packed dirt to crushed gravel that spoke of money and maintenance. By the time the ranch house came into full view, perched atop the hill like a crown on a conqueror's head, Ohiteka had seen enough to understand exactly what kind of man Edgar Calloway was. The house was a monument to stolen prosperity. 2 stories of whitewashed adobe and timber. It sprawled across the hilltop with a wide veranda wrapping around 3 sides, supported by carved wooden posts that gleamed with fresh varnish. The roof was red clay tile, imported at great expense, and the windows were fitted with real glass, not the oiled paper most frontier homes made do with. Flower beds lined the front walk, tended and watered despite the drought that had left the rest of the territory gasping. Behind the main house stood a massive barn, freshly painted in deep red, and beyond that stretched corrals filled with prime cattle, their hides sleek and healthy, their water troughs full. Ohiteka dismounted at the edge of the property, near a wooden fence that marked the boundary. He tied his horse to a post and stood for a moment, taking in the scene with the practiced eye of a warrior who had learned long ago to assess his battleground before engaging. 3 men worked near the barn, ranch hands by the look of them, their movements lazy in the afternoon heat. A woman hung laundry on a line near the side of the house, her dress clean and pressed, her apron white as snow. Smoke curled from the kitchen chimney, carrying the scent of roasting meat and baking bread. The contrast to Ruth Mackenzie's hollow-eyed desperation could not have been sharper. This was a place built on plenty, maintained through cruelty, and fortified by the kind of legal theft that wore a respectable face. Ohiteka had seen it before, among his own people and among the whites. Power always found ways to justify itself, to dress robbery in the language of law and debt. He walked forward, his stride unhurried but purposeful, his boots crunching on the gravel drive. The ranch hands noticed him immediately, their conversation dying as they straightened from their work. One of them, a lanky man with a sun-scorched face and a revolver on his hip, took a step forward, his hand drifting toward his weapon. The Comanche stopped 10 feet from them, his arms loose at his sides, his expression neutral. He spoke in English, his accent thick but his words clear. "I'm here to see Edgar Calloway." The lanky ranch hand spat tobacco juice into the dirt and looked Ohiteka up and down with obvious disdain. "Mr. Calloway don't receive Indians without an appointment. You got business, you can state it to me, and I'll decide if it's worth his time." Ohiteka's gaze did not waver. His voice, when he responded, carried a quiet authority that made the ranch hand's swagger falter. "Tell him a man has come to discuss Ruth Mackenzie and what was taken from her. Tell him now." The ranch hand's face reddened, caught between indignation and uncertainty. He glanced at his companions, neither of whom seemed eager to intervene, then turned and stalked toward the house, muttering under his breath. Ohiteka waited, his hands resting lightly on his belt, his breathing slow and steady. The other 2 ranch hands kept their distance, eyeing him with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Minutes passed. The sun beat down, relentless and heavy. Then the front door of the house opened, and Edgar Calloway emerged. He was a man in his late 40s, tall and broad through the shoulders, his frame carrying the weight of too many rich meals. His face was handsome in a blunt, aggressive way, with a strong jaw, a thick mustache, and eyes the color of cold steel. He wore a tailored vest over a white shirt, dark trousers held up by suspenders, and polished leather boots that clicked against the veranda boards as he walked. A gold watch chain glinted across his vest, and his fingers bore 2 heavy rings. Everything about him spoke of prosperity earned through ruthlessness. Calloway stopped at the top of the porch steps, his hands resting on his hips, and looked down at Ohiteka with an expression of amused contempt. "Well now, this is a curious sight. A Comanche warrior standing on my property, asking about Ruth Mackenzie. You her new protector, Indian? She sent you up here to beg on her behalf." Ohiteka's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "I do not beg. I have come to understand how a woman and child were left to starve, while the man who took everything from them lives in wealth." Calloway laughed, a sharp bark of sound that held no humor. "Took from them. Is that the story she's peddling? Let me educate you, savage. Daniel Mackenzie, God rest his fool soul, borrowed heavily from me to keep that ranch running. Cattle, equipment, land improvements, all financed through my generosity. When he got himself killed playing Texas Ranger, those debts came due. I had every legal right to claim what was owed. The fact that his widow couldn't manage the property isn't my concern." Ohiteka took a step forward, his movements deliberate. "You speak of law as if it cannot be twisted. I've seen how your law works. Papers signed under pressure, debts invented, witnesses paid to remember things that never happened. A woman alone, grieving, has no power against a man like you." Calloway's amusement faded, his expression hardening. "You're treading dangerous ground, Indian. I don't know what Ruth told you, but she's a liar and a beggar who couldn't accept that her husband was a failure. She refused to leave gracefully, so I had her removed. That's not theft. That's business. And the child," Ohiteka said, his voice dropping lower, acquiring an edge that made the ranch hands shift nervously. "The baby who has not eaten in 2 days. Is her hunger also business?" Calloway's face flushed red, anger replacing condescension. "What happens to that woman and her brat is none of my concern, and certainly none of yours. Now get off my land before I have my men throw you off." Ohiteka stood his ground. His hand moved to his belt, where a long knife hung in a beaded sheath. He did not draw it, but the gesture was clear. The ranch hands behind him tensed, hands moving toward their guns. The air grew thick with potential violence, a powder keg waiting for a spark. But Ohiteka did not come for bloodshed, not yet. He had learned patience in his years, had learned that true strength lay not in the first blow, but in choosing when to strike. He let his hand fall away from the knife and spoke again, his words measured and deliberate. "I will leave your land, Edgar Calloway. But know this, the debt you speak of, the legal theft you hide behind, it has created a new debt, one that will be paid. If that woman and child suffer further, I will return. And when I do, your law will not protect you." Calloway's face twisted with rage. He took a step forward, jabbing a finger toward Ohiteka. "You threaten me? On my own property. Boys, get this savage out of here. Use whatever force necessary." The 3 ranch hands moved forward, drawing their revolvers, but they moved with hesitation, none eager to be the first to engage. Ohiteka turned slowly, his gaze sweeping across each of them in turn, and what they saw in his eyes made them pause. This was not a man who would fall easily. This was a warrior who had survived battles they could not imagine, who carried death as comfortably as they carried their guns. Ohiteka walked back to his horse with measured steps, unhurried, his back straight. He untied the reins and mounted in one smooth motion, then turned the roan to face the house once more. Calloway stood on the veranda, his face purple with fury, his fists clenched at his sides. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." "Remember my words," Ohiteka said, his voice carrying across the distance. "A debt will be paid." Then he turned his horse and rode back down the hill, leaving Calloway and his ranch hands staring after him in impotent rage. By the time Ohiteka returned to San Rafael, the sun had begun its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The town was quieter now, the midday heat having driven most people indoors. He rode slowly down the main street, his eyes scanning the buildings until he found what he was looking for. A small, ramshackle structure at the eastern edge of town, barely more than a lean-to with walls. It stood apart from the other buildings, isolated as if the town itself had pushed it away. The walls were rough timber, weathered grey by sun and wind, the gaps between boards wide enough to let in light and cold alike. The roof was patched tin and tattered canvas, held down by rocks and rope. There was no door, only a piece of cloth hung across the entrance, faded and torn. Ohiteka dismounted and approached slowly, not wanting to startle the occupants. He could hear sounds from inside, the soft murmur of a woman's voice, the faint whimper of a child. He stopped at the cloth door and spoke quietly. "Ruth Mackenzie, it is Ohiteka. I have returned." There was a moment of silence, then the cloth was pulled aside and Ruth appeared. She looked even more exhausted than before, her face drawn and pale, but her eyes held a spark that had not been there in the street. In her arms, Hazel was awake, her small face still too pale but her eyes more focused. The baby was chewing on a piece of dried meat, her tiny hands gripping it with desperate intensity. Ruth's voice was hoarse but steadied by gratitude. "You came back. I did not think I would see you again." Ohiteka gestured toward the interior of the shack. "May I enter?" Ruth hesitated only a moment, then stepped back, holding the cloth aside. Ohiteka had to duck to fit through the low entrance, and once inside, he had to hunch to avoid hitting his head on the sloping roof. The space was barely 10 feet square, with a dirt floor and no furniture save for a pile of rags in one corner that served as a bed. A small fire pit had been dug near the center, cold now, with a few sticks of wood stacked beside it. The air smelled of damp earth, smoke, and unwashed bodies. Ohiteka's jaw tightened as he took in the conditions. This was not shelter. This was survival at its most desperate. He turned to Ruth, who stood watching him with a mixture of apprehension and hope. "I went to Calloway's ranch," Ruth's breath caught. "What happened?" Ohiteka's expression darkened. "He is, as you described, a man who hides theft behind law and feels no shame for the suffering he causes. He will not willingly return what he took." Ruth's shoulders sagged, the brief spark of hope dimming. "Then there is nothing to be done. He has the power, the money, the sheriff in his pocket." "I'm no one." Ohiteka stepped closer, his presence filling the small space. "You are not no one. You are a mother fighting for her child. That makes you stronger than any man who steals through paper and lies." He reached into the pouch at his belt and pulled out more dried meat, a small bag of cornmeal and a handful of dried berries. He placed them on the ground near the fire pit, then straightened. "This will last you several days if you are careful. But you cannot stay here. This place is not fit for a dog, much less a woman and child." Ruth's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. "I have nowhere else to go. No family, no friends who will take me in. The town has made it clear I am not welcome." Ohiteka was silent for a long moment, his mind working through possibilities. Then he spoke, his voice firm with decision. "There is a place, 3 miles south, near the dry creek bed. An old adobe house abandoned for years. The roof is intact, the walls are sound. It was built by a Mexican family who left during the war. No one claims it now." Ruth stared at him, disbelief and hope warring in her expression. "You would help me move there." "I will do more than that," Ohiteka said. "I will make it livable. Bring water, firewood, supplies. You and the child will have shelter and food while you regain your strength." "But why?" Ruth whispered, her voice breaking. "Why would you do this for us? You do not know me. I have nothing to offer you." Ohiteka met her gaze, and for the first time, something softened in his hard features. "I know what it is to be cast out, to be seen as less than human, to watch those you love suffer because others have decided your life has no value. I will not stand by and watch it happen again." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken history. Ruth understood then that this man, this Comanche warrior, carried his own scars, his own losses. She nodded slowly, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks, but these were tears of gratitude, of relief, of a burden shared. "Thank you," she whispered. "I do not have words enough to thank you." Ohiteka shook his head. "Words are not needed. Action is what matters." He turned to leave, then paused at the entrance. "Tomorrow at first light I will come with a wagon. Pack what little you have. We will move you to the adobe house. And then," he added, his voice hardening, "we will address the matter of Edgar Calloway." Ruth's breath caught. "What do you mean?" Ohiteka looked back at her, his dark eyes unreadable but burning with quiet intensity. "He believes his law protects him, but there are laws older than paper, older than courts, laws of balance and justice that do not bend to wealth. He will learn this." Before Ruth could respond, Ohiteka ducked through the doorway and disappeared into the fading light. She stood in the entrance of the shack, holding Hazel close, and watched as the towering figure mounted his horse and rode toward the edge of town. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the earth, and in those shadows, Ruth saw the shape of something she had not dared to hope for, justice, that night. As Ruth lay on the pile of rags with Hazel curled against her chest, she felt the child's breathing grow steadier, deeper, the rhythm of sleep rather than exhaustion. The food Ohiteka had brought was already making a difference. Hazel's color was better, her grip stronger. Ruth pressed her lips to her daughter's forehead and allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that they might survive this. But even as hope bloomed in her chest, a darker thought lingered. Edgar Calloway was not a man who would accept challenge lightly. He had wealth, power, and men willing to do his bidding. Ohiteka, for all his strength and resolve, was one man alone. And the history between whites and Comanche in this territory was written in blood. Ruth closed her eyes and whispered a prayer into the darkness, a prayer for protection, for justice, for the impossible hope that one man's courage might be enough to stand against the greed of another. Outside, the Texas night settled over the land, vast and indifferent. Coyotes called in the distance, their voices rising and falling like a chorus of ghosts. The stars wheeled overhead, ancient and cold, bearing witness to the struggles of those below. And somewhere in that darkness, Ohiteka sat by his own fire, sharpening his knife with long, deliberate strokes, his mind turning over the problem of Edgar Calloway like a wolf circling prey. He had made a promise to Ruth Mackenzie, and he would keep it. But promises made in blood were not easily fulfilled, and the path ahead would require more than words. It would require a reckoning. Dawn came slowly to the Texas plains, the sky lightening from black to deep purple, then to a pale gray that held no promise of rain. Ruth woke before the sun broke the horizon, her body conditioned by months of survival to wake at the slightest sound, the slightest shift in temperature. Hazel still slept against her chest, the baby's breathing steady and deep, her small body warmer and more relaxed than it had been in weeks. Ruth lay still for a moment, savoring the sensation of her daughter's heartbeat against her own, a rhythm that meant life continued despite everything. She heard the wagon before she saw it, the creak of wooden wheels and the steady clip of hooves on hard-packed earth. Ruth rose carefully, laying Hazel on the pile of rags and covering her with the thin blanket. She stepped to the cloth doorway and pulled it aside. Squinting into the early morning light, Ohiteka sat atop a weathered buckboard wagon, pulled by two sturdy draft horses, whose coats gleamed dull brown in the dawn. The wagon bed was filled with supplies, stacked crates and canvas-wrapped bundles, coils of rope, tools whose metal caught the first rays of sunlight. The Comanche warrior wore the same buckskin clothing as before, but he had added a wide-brimmed hat that shaded his face, making his features harder to read. He brought the wagon to a halt in front of the shack and climbed down with the same fluid grace that seemed impossible for a man of his size. His eyes met Ruth's and he gave a single nod. "It is time." Ruth's throat tightened with emotion she could not name. She nodded back, then turned to gather what little she owned. It took less than 5 minutes. A few pieces of clothing, worn and patched beyond recognition. A tin cup, a wooden spoon, a single plate with a chip along the rim. The blanket that covered Hazel. The silver watch she had tried to sell, now returned to her by Ohiteka the previous day with the quiet instruction to keep it. And finally, Hazel herself, bundled in Ruth's arms, still drowsy from sleep. Ohiteka took the meager bundle from Ruth without comment and placed it gently in the wagon bed. Then he turned and, without asking permission, reached for Hazel. Ruth hesitated only a heartbeat before allowing him to take her daughter. The child looked impossibly small in his massive hands, but he held her with a tenderness that belied his warrior's bearing, cradling her against his chest as he lifted Ruth onto the wagon seat with his free hand. He handed Hazel back to her mother, then climbed up beside them and took the reins. The horses leaned into their harnesses, and the wagon lurched forward, wheels groaning as they began the journey south. They left San Rafael behind without ceremony, the town still largely asleep, only a few early risers visible in doorways or on porches. Ruth did not look back. There was nothing there for her anymore, no memory untainted by loss, no face that had shown her kindness in her darkest hour. The shack she was leaving was not a home, merely a place where she had waited to die. What lay ahead could not be worse. The road south was little more than a trail, rutted and uneven, winding through scrubland dotted with mesquite and prickly pear. The air was cool still, though Ruth knew the heat would build quickly once the sun climbed higher. Hazel dozed in her arms, occasionally stirring to make small sounds of contentment that filled Ruth with fierce gratitude. The food Ohiteka had provided was already working its miracle, bringing color back to the child's cheeks, strength back to her small limbs. They rode in silence for the first mile. The only sounds, the creak of the wagon, the steady rhythm of hoofbeats, and the distant cry of a red-tailed hawk circling overhead. Ruth stole glances at the man beside her, studying his profile in the growing light. His face was set in concentration, his eyes scanning the landscape with the practiced awareness of someone who had spent a lifetime reading the land for signs of danger or opportunity. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, Ruth spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you help us, truly? You said you know what it is to be cast out, but there must be more to it than that." Ohiteka was quiet for so long, Ruth thought he would not answer. The wagon rolled on, the sun breaking free of the horizon now, flooding the plains with golden light. Then, without looking at her, he began to speak, his voice low and measured, each word chosen with care. 20 winters ago, I had a wife. Her name was Mira. She was Lipan Apache, taken in a raid when she was young and raised among my people. We married in the old way, and for 5 years we lived well. She gave me a son. We named him Taka, which means strong in your language. He paused, his jaw tightening, and Ruth saw the way his hands gripped the reins, knuckles paling, despite the bronze of his skin. There was a drought that year, worse than this one. The buffalo herds moved north, following the grass. We followed, but so did the white soldiers. They said we had left our territory, broken the treaty. We tried to explain, tried to show them we were only hunting, that we would return when the rains came. They did not care. His voice dropped lower, taking on an edge like flint scraping steel. They attacked at dawn. We fought back, but we were outnumbered. Many died. I was separated from Mira and Taka in the chaos. When the shooting stopped, I searched through the dead and wounded. I found them near the river. Mira had been shot trying to protect our son. Taka was in her arms. He was 3 years old. The soldiers said later it was an accident, that in the confusion of battle, mistakes happen. But I saw the bodies. I saw where the bullets entered. Those were not the mistakes of panicked men. Those were executions. Ruth's breath caught in her chest, horror and empathy flooding through her in equal measure. She looked down at Hazel, imagining the unspeakable pain of finding her child dead, and felt tears burn hot in her eyes. Ohiteka continued, his voice steady now, as if by telling the story he could master the emotion it carried. I buried them in the traditional way and left that place. I could not stay with my people. The grief was too heavy, and everywhere I looked I saw ghosts. So I wandered. I have lived among whites, among Mexicans, among other tribes. I have learned your languages, your customs. I have tried to understand why such cruelty exists in men who call themselves civilized. He turned to look at Ruth then, and his eyes held a depth of sorrow that made her chest ache. When I saw you in that street, holding your starving child, begging men who turned away, I saw Mira, I saw Taka, and I knew I could not walk past. Not again, not when I have the power to act. Ruth's tears spilled over, running hot down her cheeks. She reached out without thinking and placed her hand over his, where it rested on the reins. His skin was warm, rough, alive. I am so sorry for what was done to you. No words can ever be enough, but I'm sorry. Ohiteka looked down at her hand, then back at the road ahead. He did not pull away. Sorrow changes nothing, but action can. That is why we ride now. They continued on in silence after that. But it was a different kind of silence, no longer awkward or uncertain, but companionable. The silence of two people who had shared their wounds and found them recognized. The sun climbed higher, the heat building, but a faint breeze stirred from the south, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant water. By mid-morning, they reached the adobe house. It sat in a small hollow near what had once been a creek bed, now reduced to scattered pools of brackish water and long stretches of cracked mud. The structure was modest, a single-room dwelling with thick walls the color of sand, a flat roof of timber and packed earth, and a single door that hung slightly askew on leather hinges. 2 small windows, empty of glass or covering, stared out like hollow eyes, but despite its neglect the house was sound. The walls showed no major cracks, the roof appeared intact, and the door, though weathered, was still functional. It was infinitely better than the shack Ruth had been living in, and as Ohitika brought the wagon to a halt in front of it, Ruth felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest, hope mixed with disbelief, as if accepting this gift might somehow cause it to vanish. Ohitika climbed down and began unloading supplies with efficient, economical movements. Ruth descended more slowly, still holding Hazel, and approached the doorway. She pushed the door open, wincing at the groan of hinges, and stepped inside. The interior was dim and cool, the thick adobe walls providing insulation against the heat. The floor was packed earth, hard and level. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its chimney rising through the roof. There was no furniture, but wooden pegs had been driven into the walls at intervals, clearly meant for hanging clothes or tools. In one corner, a raised platform of adobe had been built, likely intended as a sleeping area. Dust covered everything, thick and undisturbed, and cobwebs draped the corners like tattered lace. But underneath the neglect, Ruth could see the care that had gone into building this place, the skill of hands that had shaped each adobe brick, fitted each timber, smoothed each surface. This had been someone's home once, built with intention and hope. She turned as Ohitika entered carrying an armload of supplies. He set them down near the fireplace and straightened, his eyes surveying the space with the same assessing look he had given Calloway's ranch. This will need work. Cleaning, repairs, but it is solid. You will be safe here. Ruth nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Hazel stirred in her arms, waking fully now, her eyes bright and curious as she looked around the new space. The baby reached out one small hand toward a shaft of sunlight streaming through the window, her fingers opening and closing as if trying to grasp the light itself. Over the next several hours, Ohitika worked with a purpose and efficiency that left Ruth amazed. He swept out the interior with a brush of bundled grass, cleared the cobwebs, inspected the fireplace, and declared it safe to use. He unloaded the supplies from the wagon, revealing far more than Ruth had realized he was carrying. There were blankets, thick and woven from wool, a cast-iron pot for cooking, tin plates and cups, a bag of beans, another of cornmeal, a third of dried apples, candles made from tallow, a water barrel, which he filled from the creek pools after testing them and finding the water, while not ideal, drinkable. He even produced a small wooden cradle, worn but sturdy, which he set up in the corner near the sleeping platform. Ruth watched all this with growing astonishment, trying several times to help, but finding herself gently waved aside. Ohitika seemed to need no assistance, his movements sure and practiced, as if he had done this many times before. She realized he probably had, setting up camps, building shelters, creating homes in hostile territory. By afternoon, the transformation was remarkable. The house was clean, the fireplace laid with kindling and wood ready to light. The supplies were organized along one wall, the blankets folded on the sleeping platform. The cradle held a soft bundle of cloth that would serve as bedding for Hazel. It was still sparse, still modest, but it was a home. Ohitika stood in the doorway, surveying his work with satisfaction. He turned to Ruth, who stood holding Hazel, tears streaming freely down her face now, no longer bothering to hide them. "This is too much," she whispered. "I can never repay you for this." Ohitika shook his head. "There is no debt. This is what should be, what must be, when we see suffering and have the means to ease it. Your people talk much of charity and Christian duty, but they practice it poorly. My people have always known that survival depends on helping those who cannot help themselves. It is not kindness. It is necessity." He moved toward the door, clearly intending to leave, but Ruth stepped forward quickly, her free hand reaching out to touch his arm. "Wait, please. Stay for a meal at least. Let me cook for you. It is a small thing, but it is something I can do." Ohiteka hesitated, clearly unused to such offers, but after a moment he nodded. "I will tend to the horses first. Then I will return." He left, and Ruth set Hazel in the cradle, marveling at how the baby settled immediately, her eyes already growing heavy again as sleep pulled at her. Ruth moved to the supplies and selected ingredients, her hands working with a sureness they had not felt in months. She built a fire in the hearth, the smoke drawing cleanly up the chimney. She set the pot on the iron grate and began preparing a simple stew. Beans and dried meat and a few wild onions Ohiteka had gathered near the creek. As she worked, she found herself humming, a tune her mother had taught her years ago, before the world had grown so hard. The sound surprised her and she stopped, then started again, letting the melody fill the small space. Hazel made a small sound of contentment from the cradle, and Ruth felt something loosen in her chest. Some knot of tension and fear that had been pulled tight for so long she had forgotten it was there. When Ohiteka returned, the stew was bubbling, filling the house with rich, savory smells. He ducked through the doorway and paused, his nostrils flaring as he caught the scent. Something shifted in his expression, a softening that made him look younger, less burdened. Ruth ladled the stew into tin bowls and handed one to him along with a wooden spoon. They sat on the floor near the fireplace, the warmth pleasant as the day began to cool. For a while, neither spoke, both focused on the meal. It was simple food, but after the deprivation of recent weeks, it tasted like a feast. Finally, Ruth broke the silence, her voice thoughtful. "You have given us so much, a home, food, safety. But Edgar Calloway will not forget what happened yesterday. Men like him do not accept challenges to their power. I fear he will come here, or send men to drive us away." Ohiteka finished his stew and set the bowl aside. His expression grew serious, the brief lightness fading back into the warrior's mask. "He will try, but he does not know this land as I do. This house is not visible from the main trail. Few know it exists. "And I will make sure you are not found, but you cannot stay here always," Ruth said, her voice tinged with worry. "You have your own life, your own path. I cannot ask you to stand guard over us indefinitely." Ohiteka met her gaze, his dark eyes intense. "You do not ask, I choose. And I will continue to choose until the threat is ended." "How?" Ruth whispered. "How do we end a man like Edgar Calloway?" Ohiteka was silent for a long moment, his jaw working as he considered his words. Then he spoke, his voice low and measured. "There are ways to fight that do not involve bullets and blood, though those may come in the end. First, we gather truth. We find others he has wronged, others who would speak against him if they felt safe doing so. We build a case that even his board sheriff cannot ignore. And if that fails," he added, his eyes hardening, "then we use older methods. Methods that do not rely on white man's law." Ruth shivered despite the warmth of the fire. She thought of Daniel, her husband, who had believed in law and order, who had worn a ranger's star and died trying to protect people who would later abandon his widow and child. She thought of the papers Calloway had used to steal her ranch, documents that might be legal, but were no less theft for all that. "Then I will help," she said quietly. "I will do whatever is necessary. For Hazel, for Daniel's memory." And she added, meeting Ohiteka's gaze, "For you. Because you deserve to see justice done as much as I do." Ohiteka held her gaze for a long moment, and something passed between them, an understanding, a bond forged not in comfort, but in shared pain and shared purpose. He nodded once, then rose to his feet. "Rest tonight. Tomorrow we begin." He moved to the door, then paused and looked back at Ruth, who still sat by the fire, Hazel sleeping peacefully in the cradle nearby. The firelight played across Ruth's face, highlighting the sharp angles hunger had carved, but also the strength that had kept her alive, kept her fighting when others would have surrendered. "You are stronger than you know, Ruth Mackenzie," Ohiteka said quietly. Do not forget that." Then he was gone, slipping out into the gathering dusk, leaving Ruth alone with her daughter and her thoughts. She sat for a long time watching the fire burn down to coals, listening to Hazel's soft breathing, feeling the solid walls around her, the roof over her head for the first time in 8 months. Ruth Mackenzie allowed herself to believe that she might survive, that her daughter might grow up, that the future might hold something more than suffering and loss. Outside, the Texas night settled over the land, vast and star-scattered. Coyotes sang their evening chorus, and somewhere in the darkness an owl called, its voice lonely and haunting. But inside the adobe house, Ruth felt safe, protected not just by walls, but by the promise of a man who had chosen to stand between her and the cruelty of the world. And in that moment, as she drifted towards sleep, with her hand resting on the edge of Hazel's cradle, Ruth understood that sometimes salvation came not from the places we expected, not from family or community or the institutions we were taught to trust, but from strangers who recognized our pain because they had carried their own. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers. Edgar Calloway would not rest, and the battle ahead would require courage Ruth was not sure she possessed. But tonight, in this moment, she had shelter and food and hope, and that, she thought as sleep finally claimed her, was enough. 3 days passed in the adobe house, and in that time, Ruth felt herself transform from a hollow shell of survival into something approaching a living woman again. The steady supply of food, the safety of solid walls, and the promise of protection had worked a quiet miracle. Hazel had blossomed most dramatically, her cheeks filling out, her laughter returning in bright peals that echoed off the adobe walls. The baby had begun to crawl, pulling herself across the packed earth floor with determined enthusiasm. Exploring every corner of their small sanctuary, Ruth established routines that gave structure to the days. She woke at dawn to build the fire, boiled water from the creek after straining it through cloth, prepared simple meals of beans and cornmeal that nonetheless felt luxurious after weeks of starvation. She swept the floor daily, washed their few clothes in the creek pools, hung them to dry on a rope Ohiteka had strung between 2 mesquite trees. She sang to Hazel as she worked, old songs her mother had taught her, hymns from a church she no longer attended, lullabies that brought tears to her eyes with their memories of better times. Ohiteka came each morning, arriving as the sun broke the horizon, bringing fresh supplies and news from town. He had taken to scouting San Rafael at night, moving through shadows, listening at windows, gathering information about Edgar Calloway's movements and intentions. What he learned was troubling. On the 4th morning he arrived earlier than usual, his expression grave. Ruth was nursing Hazel when she heard his horse approach, and she quickly adjusted her dress before stepping outside to greet him. The air was cool still, carrying the scent of sage and approaching autumn. Ohiteka dismounted and tied his horse, then turned to face her with an intensity that made her stomach clench. "Calloway has been asking questions," he said without preamble. "He sent men into town yesterday, showing your description, asking if anyone has seen you. He is telling people you stole from him, that you are dangerous and disturbed by grief. He has offered a reward for information about your whereabouts." Ruth's blood ran cold. "How much?" $20. Enough to tempt those who are hungry or desperate. She felt the world tilt beneath her feet, the fragile security of the past days crumbling like sand. "He will find us. Someone will talk. $20 is more money than most people in San Rafael see in a month." Ohiteka stepped closer, his presence solid and reassuring despite the grim news. "He will not find us. I have made certain this place remains unknown, but we can no longer wait. We must act now, before he tightens his net further." Ruth swallowed hard, forcing down the panic rising in her throat. "What do you propose?" Ohiteka's jaw tightened, and when he spoke his voice carried the weight of a plan long considered. "There is a man in San Rafael. His name is Thomas Whitmore. He owned the land adjacent to your husband's ranch. 3 years ago, Calloway drove him off using similar methods, false debts, forged documents, pressure from the sheriff. Whitmore lost everything, and now works as a ranch hand for another man 15 miles north. He has reason to hate Calloway as much as you do. Ruth's heart quickened. You think he would help us? I think he would speak truth if given the chance and the protection to do so. But he is not the only one. There is a woman, Maria Santos, whose husband died in an accident at Calloway's ranch 2 years ago. She claims it was no accident, that her husband discovered Calloway was running stolen cattle and was killed to silence him. And there is a clerk at the land office, a young man named Peter Chen, who has hinted to others that the documents Calloway presents are often irregular. Though he has been too afraid to speak openly, Ruth felt a surge of something she had not experienced in months. Not hope exactly, but something fiercer, more dangerous. The possibility of justice. If we could bring them together, get them to speak as one voice, it would still not be enough, Ohiteka interrupted, his tone pragmatic. Calloway owns the sheriff. The nearest federal marshal is 3 days' ride away, and by the time we could reach him, Calloway would have time to silence witnesses or disappear evidence. No, we need something more immediate, something that cannot be ignored or suppressed. What? Ruth asked. Though she already sensed the answer would require courage, she was not certain she possessed. Ohiteka met her gaze steadily. We need to force Calloway into a public confrontation in front of the whole town, where his lies and threats are exposed for all to see. We need to make him reveal his true nature in a way that even those who profit from his corruption cannot ignore. Ruth's mind raced, trying to imagine how such a thing could be accomplished. And how do we do that? Ohiteka's expression grew harder, more dangerous. We give him a target he cannot resist. We let him think he has won. And then we turn his victory into his downfall. The plan Ohiteka laid out was audacious and terrifying in equal measure. Ruth would return to San Rafael, not in hiding but openly, walking into the town square during the busiest part of the day. She would carry Hazel and confront Calloway publicly, accusing him before witnesses of theft and murder. Ohiteka knew Calloway's pride would not allow such an insult to stand unanswered. He would respond, and in responding he would reveal himself. But the plan required others to be present, witnesses who could corroborate Ruth's claims, who could speak their own truths when the moment came. That meant approaching the people Ohiteka had identified, convincing them to risk everything for a chance at justice. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. That afternoon, they rode north to find Thomas Whitmore. The journey took them through terrain that grew gradually hillier, the scrubland giving way to rocky outcroppings and scattered oak trees. They found Whitmore's current employer's ranch nestled in a valley where a spring-fed creek still ran with clear water, a rare blessing in the drought-stricken land. Thomas Whitmore was a man in his 50s, his face weathered by sun and hardship, his body lean and corded with muscle from hard labor. He was mending a fence when they arrived, his hands working with practiced efficiency. He looked up at the sound of their approach, his expression wary, then shocked as he recognized Ruth. "Mrs. Mackenzie," he breathed, setting down his tools and approaching slowly. "I heard you had left San Rafael. I feared the worst." Ruth dismounted with Ohiteka's help, holding Hazel against her hip. "Mr. Whitmore, I need your help. We need your help. It is about Edgar Calloway." Whitmore's face darkened at the name, a muscle jumping in his jaw. He glanced at Ohiteka, taking in the Comanche warrior's imposing presence. Then back at Ruth. What kind of help? Ruth explained the plan, watching Whitmore's expression shift from suspicion to interest to fear and finally to something harder. A resolve born of old anger given new purpose. When she finished, Whitmore was silent for a long moment, his eyes distant, as if looking back through years of injustice. "He took everything from me," Whitmore said finally, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "My land, my livelihood, my dignity. He used forged papers and paid witnesses, and when I tried to fight him in court, the judge ruled against me before I could even present my evidence. I've wanted to see him answer for his crimes for 3 years, but I am one man with no power and no proof." "You will not be alone," Ohiteka said quietly. "There are others, and this time the confrontation will not happen in a courtroom he controls. It will happen in the light of day, before the entire town." Whitmore looked at Ohiteka for a long moment, assessing, then nodded slowly. "I will do it. Tell me when and where, and I will be there." They left Whitmore's ranch as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, and rode southeast toward San Rafael, where Maria Santos lived in a small house on the edge of town. They arrived after dark, approaching carefully, knowing that Calloway's men might be watching for Ruth. Maria Santos answered the door with a rifle in her hands, her eyes fierce and frightened in equal measure. She was a woman of perhaps 35, her black hair streaked with premature gray, her face lined with grief that had hardened into permanent anger. When she saw Ruth, recognition flashed across her features, followed quickly by alarm. "You should not be here," Maria hissed, glancing past them into the darkness. "Calloway is looking for you. There is a reward." "I know," Ruth said quietly. "That is why I have come. I need to ask you about your husband, about how he died." Maria's face went rigid, her knuckles whitening on the rifle. Her voice, when she spoke, was cold as winter wind. "My husband did not die. He was murdered. By Edgar Calloway or by men Calloway paid. It does not matter which. The result is the same." "Will you tell that to the town?" Ruth asked. "Will you stand with me and speak the truth publicly, even knowing it will make you a target?" Maria stared at her for a long moment, then lowered the rifle. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, but her voice remained steady. "I have lived with fear and silence for 2 years. It has not brought me peace or safety. If there is a chance, even a small one, to see justice done, I will take it." The next morning they approached Peter Chen, the land office clerk. He was a young man of Chinese descent, perhaps 25, who had come to Texas as a child with his parents during the railroad construction boom. He lived in a boarding house and walked to work each day with his head down, avoiding eye contact, trying to remain invisible in a town that often treated him as less than human. They intercepted him on his way to work, Ohiteka stepping out of an alley to block his path while Ruth emerged from the other side. Chen's eyes went wide with fear, his hand moving toward his jacket, where Ruth glimpsed the handle of a small knife. "Mr. Chen," Ruth said quickly, holding up her hands to show she meant no harm. "Please, we only wish to talk. It's about Edgar Calloway and the land office documents." Chen's face went pale. He glanced around frantically, as if expecting Calloway's men to appear from nowhere. "I cannot talk about this. I will lose my position. Perhaps worse." "You already know worse is coming," Ohiteka said, his voice low but not unkind. "Men like Calloway always turn on those who serve them. You have seen things, irregular documents, forged signatures. You know the truth. How long before he decides you know too much?" Chen's hands trembled, but he did not run. His voice when he spoke was barely above a whisper. "What do you want from me?" Ruth stepped closer, her voice urgent. "In 3 days, there will be a public gathering in the town square. I'm going to confront Calloway before witnesses. I need you to bring the documents, the ones that show irregularities. You do not have to speak if you are too afraid. Just bring the evidence and let others see it." Chen closed his eyes, his entire body shaking. For a long moment, Ruth thought he would refuse, would turn and run. Then he opened his eyes, and she saw something unexpected there, a spark of defiance that had been buried under years of submission. "I will do it," Chen whispered. "But if this fails, if Calloway remains in power, I am a dead man." "If this fails," Ohiteka said quietly, "we are all dead. That is why it cannot fail." The next 2 days were spent in careful preparation. Ohiteka scouted the town repeatedly, mapping Calloway's movements, identifying where his men were stationed, planning routes of approach and escape. Ruth rehearsed what she would say, practicing until the words felt natural, despite the terror that accompanied them. She wrote out her testimony, detailing every interaction with Calloway, every document he had presented, every threat he had made. On the evening before the planned confrontation, as Ruth sat by the fire in the adobe house with Hazel sleeping in her cradle, Ohiteka appeared in the doorway with something in his hands. He entered and knelt beside Ruth, holding out a bundle wrapped in soft leather. Ruth unwrapped it carefully and gasped. Inside was a dress, not new, but clean and carefully mended, made of deep blue cotton with white lace at the collar and cuffs. It was simple, but respectable, the kind of dress a dignified woman would wear to church or to town. "Where did you get this?" Ruth whispered, running her fingers over the fabric. "I traded for it," Ohiteka said simply. "Tomorrow, when you face Calloway, you will not do so looking like a beggar. You will stand before him as the woman you are, the widow of a Texas ranger, the rightful owner of stolen land. You will show him and the town that poverty does not equal worthlessness." Ruth's eyes filled with tears, but these were not tears of sorrow. She looked at Ohiteka, this man who had appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer she had not known how to speak, and felt something shift in her chest, something deep and profound that she could not yet name. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything, not just the dress, but for seeing me when no one else would, for believing I was worth saving." Ohiteka's expression softened, and for a moment the warrior's mask fell away, revealing something vulnerable beneath. "You saved yourself, Ruth Mackenzie. I merely gave you tools. The strength was always yours." He rose to leave, but Ruth reached out and caught his hand. He stopped, looking down at where her small, pale fingers wrapped around his large bronze ones. The firelight played across their joined hands, highlighting the contrast, the connection. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Ruth said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her, "I want you to know that you have given me more than safety or food or shelter. You have given me back my life, my dignity, my ability to fight. That is a gift I can never repay." Ohiteka's fingers tightened around hers, just slightly, just enough. "Then you will honor it by surviving, by raising your daughter to be strong, by never again allowing anyone to make you small. That is payment enough." He released her hand and walked to the door, pausing there to look back one final time. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a vow, "we end this. Together." After he left, Ruth sat for a long time staring into the fire, the blue dress draped across her lap, Hazel sleeping peacefully nearby. She thought of Daniel, her husband, who had believed in justice and died pursuing it. She thought of all the ways the world had tried to break her, to reduce her to nothing, and how she had somehow, impossibly survived. Tomorrow would bring danger unlike anything she had faced before. Edgar Calloway was a powerful man with resources and ruthlessness to spare. The plan was audacious, relying on the courage of people who had been beaten down by life, on the hope that truth spoken loudly enough could overcome corruption. There were 1,000 ways it could fail, and failure would likely mean death. But as Ruth looked at her sleeping daughter, at the solid walls Ohiteka had helped her claim, at the dress that represented dignity restored, she felt something she had not felt in 8 months. She felt ready. Outside, the Texas night deepened, stars wheeling overhead in their ancient patterns. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called, its voice rising and falling like a warning or a promise. The wind stirred the mesquite branches, whispering secrets to the land. And in the adobe house, Ruth Mackenzie folded the blue dress carefully, lay down beside her daughter's cradle, and closed her eyes. Tomorrow, justice would be served or vengeance would be claimed. Either way, the silence would be broken. The morning of reckoning arrived, with the sky so clear and blue, it seemed to mock the gravity of what was about to unfold. Ruth woke before dawn, her heart already racing, her body tense with anticipation and dread. She dressed carefully in the blue cotton dress Ohiteka had brought her, her fingers trembling as she fastened the buttons. The fabric felt foreign against her skin, after weeks of wearing rags. But as she caught her reflection in the small mirror Ohiteka had included among the supplies, she barely recognized the woman staring back. The gauntness remained in her cheeks. The shadows under her eyes spoke of hardship endured, but there was something else now. a steel in her gaze that had been forged in the fires of survival. She braided her auburn hair and pinned it in a neat coil at the nape of her neck, then turned to Hazel, who was already awake and babbling happily in her cradle. Ruth dressed her daughter in the cleanest clothes they possessed, a small cotton dress that had been patched so many times it was more repair than original fabric. But Hazel looked healthy now, her cheeks full and pink, her eyes bright with the resilience of childhood. Ruth lifted her daughter and held her close, breathing in the sweet scent of her hair, committing this moment to memory in case it was the last peaceful one they would ever know. Ohiteka arrived as the sun broke the horizon, riding his roan stallion and leading a second horse, a gentle mare suitable for Ruth and Hazel. He dismounted and approached the doorway, stopping when he saw Ruth standing there in the blue dress. Her chin lifted, her daughter in her arms. For a long moment he simply looked at her, and Ruth saw something flash in his dark eyes, admiration perhaps, or recognition of the transformation that had occurred. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. "You look like a woman who cannot be dismissed or ignored. That is good. Today they will have no choice but to see you." Ruth managed a small smile, despite the terror churning in her stomach. "I am ready, or as ready as I will ever be." The ride to San Rafael took 40 minutes, and with each mile, Ruth felt the weight of what she was about to do press more heavily upon her. Ohiteka rode beside her in silence, his presence a steady anchor in the storm of her thoughts. As they approached the outskirts of town, he finally spoke. "Thomas Whitmore will be waiting near the mercantile. Maria Santos will be at the church. Peter Chen will come from the land office when he sees the gathering. I will position myself where I can watch Calloway's men and intervene if they attempt violence. But Ruth," he added, his voice taking on a grave tone, "once this begins, it cannot be stopped. Calloway will react, and his reaction may be dangerous. If at any moment you wish to turn back—" "No," Ruth interrupted, her voice stronger than she felt. "We have come too far. Too many people are counting on this. And Hazel deserves a future where her mother is not a fugitive, where the truth matters more than power." Ohiteka nodded, respect evident in his expression. "Then we finish what we started." They entered San Rafael from the south, riding slowly down the main street as the town began to wake. Shopkeepers were opening their doors, sweeping their porches. Women were hanging laundry, men were tending to horses at the livery. As Ruth passed, conversation stopped. Heads turned. Whispers began to spread like wildfire. "That is her, the Mackenzie widow. I thought she had left town. Look, she is with that Comanche, bold as brass, riding right down the main street. Does she not know Calloway has men looking for her?" Ruth kept her eyes forward, her spine straight, refusing to show the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. Hazel sat in front of her in the saddle, looking around with wide-eyed curiosity, oblivious to the danger. They rode to the center of town, where a small square opened up between the church, the land office, and the general store. A well stood in the middle, its stones worn smooth by years of use. Ohiteka helped Ruth dismount, then positioned himself near his horse, his hand resting casually near the knife at his belt. Ruth walked to the well and stood beside it, Hazel on her hip, and waited. She did not have to wait long. Thomas Whitmore emerged from behind the mercantile, his weathered face set with determination. He crossed the square and took up a position several feet from Ruth, nodding to her in silent support. Moments later, Maria Santos appeared from the direction of the church, her black dress stark against the dusty street, her eyes fierce and focused. She stood on Ruth's other side, creating a line of witnesses. The gathering was drawing attention now. More townspeople emerged from buildings, drawn by curiosity and the unmistakable sense that something significant was about to occur. Within minutes, a crowd had begun to form. Perhaps 30 people, then 40. Their murmurs growing louder as they recognized Ruth and speculated about what was happening. Then, from the north end of town, came the sound of hoofbeats, multiple horses moving at a trot. Edgar Calloway appeared, flanked by 4 of his ranch hands, all armed, all wearing expressions of barely contained aggression. Calloway himself rode at the center, his face dark with fury as he took in the scene before him. He dismounted with violent energy and strode toward Ruth, his boots striking the ground like hammer blows. His men followed, fanning out to either side, hands hovering near their weapons. The crowd instinctively drew back, creating a wide circle around the confrontation, but no one left. This was too important, too dramatic to miss. Calloway stopped 10 feet from Ruth, his face contorted with rage. "You have nerve, I will give you that. Showing your face in this town after stealing from me, spreading lies about me. I should have you arrested right now." Ruth's voice, when she spoke, carried across the square with surprising strength. "I've stolen nothing, Edgar Calloway. But you have. You stole my husband's ranch, using forged documents and fabricated debts. You drove me and my daughter into starvation and homelessness, and you have done the same to others. People who are here today to speak the truth you have silenced for too long." Calloway's laugh was harsh and contemptuous. "Truth? You speak of truth? You are a delusional woman driven mad by grief. Your husband was a fool who borrowed more than he could repay, and when he died, his debts became yours. I took what was legally owed to me. If you suffered afterward, that is the consequence of poor decisions, not my responsibility." Thomas Whitmore stepped forward, his voice rough but clear. "That is a lie, Calloway. You used the same methods on me 3 years ago. Forged papers, paid witnesses, a judge in your pocket. You are a thief who hides behind the law." Calloway's eyes snapped to Whitmore, narrowing with recognition and contempt. "You are a bitter old man who cannot accept his own failure. Your accusations were investigated and dismissed. No one believes you." Maria Santos moved forward then, her voice shaking with suppressed emotion but growing stronger with each word. "You killed my husband. He discovered you were running stolen cattle through your ranch, mixing them with your own herd. When he threatened to report you, he died in a convenient accident. But it was no accident. I know the truth, and so does God." Calloway's face flushed deep red, a vein pulsing at his temple. "You will watch your tongue, woman, or you will find yourself facing charges of slander. I have witnesses who will testify your husband died because of his own carelessness, nothing more." Then a new voice cut through the tension, thin and frightened, but determined. Peter Chen emerged from the land office, carrying a leather portfolio. His hands shook as he walked toward the center of the square, but he did not stop. When he reached the well, he opened the portfolio and held up a sheaf of documents. "I have worked in the land office for 4 years. Chen said, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "In that time, I have processed dozens of transactions involving Mr. Calloway. Many of them contained irregularities, signatures that did not match previous documents, debts that appeared suddenly with no prior record, dates that were altered. I said nothing because I was afraid, because I needed my position. But I cannot remain silent anymore." The crowd erupted in murmurs, some skeptical, others intrigued. Calloway's face had gone from red to white, his fury transforming into something more dangerous, calculation mixed with desperation. He took a step toward Chen, his voice low and threatening. "You are making a serious mistake, boy. Those documents are confidential. You have no authority to share them. They are public records," Chen shot back, his fear giving way to defiance. "Anyone has the right to examine them. I'm simply bringing them to light." Calloway's hand moved toward the revolver at his hip, and in that instant, the square transformed from a public forum into a powder keg. Ohiteka moved with startling speed, stepping between Calloway and Chen, his massive frame a barrier that could not be ignored. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but carried the weight of absolute authority. "You will not draw that weapon." Calloway's men tensed, their hands on their guns, but they hesitated, recognizing the danger in confronting the Comanche warrior. Calloway himself froze, his hand on the grip of his revolver, but not yet pulling it free. His eyes locked with Ohiteka's, and for a long moment the two men measured each other. Then from the edge of the crowd, a new voice spoke, aged and cracked, but carrying authority born of years. Sheriff Beckett pushed through the gathered townspeople, his star glinting in the morning sunlight. He was an old man, his face lined and weathered, his body bent with arthritis, but his eyes were sharp as he surveyed the scene. "That is enough," Beckett said, his voice cutting through the tension. "Lower your hands, all of you. There will be no shooting in my town." Calloway turned to face the sheriff, relief and confidence flooding back into his expression. "Sheriff, thank God you are here. These people are making wild accusations, disturbing the peace. I want them arrested immediately." Beckett held up a hand, silencing Calloway. His gaze moved to Ruth, then to Whitmore, to Maria Santos, to Peter Chen with his documents, and finally to Ohiteka. When he spoke again, his voice was thoughtful, almost reluctant. "I've been sheriff of San Rafael for 23 years. In that time, I have seen many things, done many things I am not proud of. I have looked the other way when powerful men bent the law because it was easier than fighting them. But I am old now, and when a man gets old, he starts thinking about what he will be remembered for." He turned to Calloway, and his expression hardened. "Edgar, I have suspected for years that your business dealings were not entirely legal. I chose not to investigate because you brought money to this town, because you had influential friends. But standing here now, listening to these testimonies, seeing the evidence that young Mr. Chen has brought forward, I cannot ignore it any longer." Calloway's face contorted with disbelief and rage. "You cannot be serious. These are the words of failures and liars. I have done nothing wrong." "Then you will not mind if I examine those documents," Beckett said, gesturing to Chen, "and if you will not mind answering questions about the deaths and dispossessions that seem to follow in your wake. If you are innocent, you have nothing to fear from an honest investigation." The crowd had grown silent, every eye fixed on the confrontation. Ruth felt her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. This was the moment, the tipping point, where justice might finally be served or might slip away once more into the darkness of corruption. Calloway looked around wildly, seeing for the first time that the crowd's mood had shifted. The townspeople were no longer looking at Ruth with contempt or dismissal. They were looking at Calloway with suspicion, with dawning realization. Some remembered their own interactions with him, their own doubts about his sudden accumulation of wealth. Seeds of doubt once planted grew quickly. Calloway's hand moved again toward his gun, and this time he drew it, not pointing it at anyone specific, but holding it ready. His voice, when he spoke, had lost all pretense of civility. "You will all regret this, every one of you. I have friends, powerful friends. A federal marshal will hear about this, and when he does, I will have you all charged with conspiracy and defamation." But even as he spoke, his men were backing away, their loyalty crumbling in the face of public scrutiny and the sheriff's opposition. One by one, they holstered their weapons and stepped back, unwilling to throw their lives away for a man whose power was suddenly revealed to be far more fragile than it had seemed. Calloway stood alone now, his gun trembling in his hand, his face a mask of impotent rage. He looked at Ruth, and in his eyes she saw hatred so pure it made her blood run cold. "This is your doing," he hissed. "You will pay for this. Mark my words." Ohiteka moved forward, placing himself between Calloway and Ruth once more. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but it carried an unmistakable threat. "You have two choices, Edgar Calloway. You can surrender your weapon to the sheriff and face justice through the law, or you can continue down this path and face justice of a different kind. Choose carefully." For a long moment, Calloway stood frozen, his entire world collapsing around him. Then, with a sound that was half sob, half snarl, he threw his revolver to the ground and stumbled backward. His face was wet with tears of rage and humiliation as he looked around at the crowd, at the people who had feared him, profited from him, or simply ignored his crimes. "Damn you all," he whispered. "Damn you all to hell." Sheriff Beckett moved forward and picked up the discarded weapon. "Edgar Calloway, I am placing you under arrest, pending investigation into multiple charges, including fraud, theft, and possible murder. You will come with me peacefully, or I will have you dragged." What followed was almost anticlimactic. Calloway, all fight drained from him, allowed himself to be led away toward the jail. His ranch hands had already disappeared, unwilling to be associated with his downfall. Peter Chen handed his documents to the sheriff, who promised to review them thoroughly and send for the federal marshal if the evidence warranted. The crowd began to disperse slowly, breaking into small groups, their conversations animated as they processed what they had witnessed. Some looked at Ruth with new respect, others with lingering suspicion, but none with the contempt that had been there before. She had forced them to see her, to acknowledge her humanity and her rights, and that could not be undone. Ruth stood by the well, Hazel still in her arms, feeling simultaneously exhausted and euphoric. Thomas Whitmore approached and placed a weathered hand on her shoulder. "You did it, Mrs. Mackenzie. You stood up to him and won. Your husband would be proud." Maria Santos embraced her briefly, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for giving me the courage to speak. For the first time in 2 years, I feel like I can breathe." Peter Chen bowed awkwardly, his relief palpable. "I'm glad I found the courage to help. Perhaps now I can sleep without nightmares." One by one they drifted away, returning to their lives forever changed by what had occurred. Finally, only Ohiteka remained, standing a respectful distance away, watching Ruth with an expression she could not quite read. She walked to him, Hazel babbling happily in her arms, and looked up into his scarred face. "I could not have done this without you. You gave me everything, safety, food, hope, courage. How can I ever thank you?" Ohiteka was silent for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. Then he reached out and gently touched Hazel's cheek, his large, calloused finger impossibly gentle. "You already have. You survived. You fought. You showed your daughter that the world can be cruel, but that courage and truth still matter." "That is thanks enough." Ruth felt tears spill down her cheeks hot and fast. "What happens now? Where do you go?" Ohiteka's expression grew distant, and Ruth sensed him pulling away, preparing to return to the solitary existence he had known before their paths crossed. "I will leave San Rafael. My presence here will only cause complications, questions. Your people and mine have too much blood between us. But I will not go far. The adobe house is yours. I will bring supplies monthly. Make sure you and Hazel want for nothing until you can reclaim what was stolen." Ruth's hand shot out and gripped his arm, stopping him. "What if I do not want you to go? What if I want you to stay, to help me rebuild the ranch, to be part of our lives?" Ohiteka looked down at her hand on his arm, then back at her face, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw uncertainty in his eyes. "The world will not understand, Ruth. They will say things, cruel things. About you, about me, about Hazel. Let them talk," Ruth said fiercely. "I've survived starvation, homelessness, and the loss of everything I held dear. I will not let small-minded people dictate who I allow into my life or my daughter's life. You saved us. You gave us back our future. If you choose to walk away, I will understand and be forever grateful. But if you choose to stay, there will be a place for you. Always." Hazel chose that moment to reach out toward Ohiteka, her small hands grasping at his tunic, her face breaking into a wide, toothless smile. The warrior looked at the child, and something in his granite expression cracked, revealing the depth of loneliness and longing beneath. "I have nowhere else to go," he admitted quietly. "No people who claim me, no home that calls me back. For years I have wandered, carrying grief like a stone. But with you, with Hazel, I have felt something I thought I had lost forever." "What?" Ruth whispered. "Purpose," Ohiteka said simply. "The sense that my life might still mean something." Ruth shifted Hazel to one hip and took Ohiteka's scarred hand in hers. "Then stay. Help me reclaim the ranch. Help me raise my daughter in a place where justice matters more than power. And maybe, in time, we can both learn to carry our grief a little easier." Ohiteka's fingers closed around hers, his grip warm and strong and alive. He nodded once, a decision made, a path chosen. "Then I will stay." The sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the morning cool, flooding San Rafael with golden light. Ruth and Ohiteka stood together in the town square, a widow and a warrior, bound by shared pain and shared hope. while Hazel played with the beadwork on Ohiteka's tunic, oblivious to the significance of the moment. In the days that followed, much changed in San Rafael. The federal marshal arrived and conducted a thorough investigation into Edgar Calloway's affairs. The evidence Peter Chen had preserved proved damning. Calloway was charged with fraud, theft, and conspiracy, his empire of stolen land dismantled piece by piece. Ruth's ranch was returned to her, along with compensation for the suffering she had endured. With Ohiteka's help, she began the long process of rebuilding. They repaired fences, replanted fields, brought in new livestock. The work was hard, but it was honest work, and at the end of each day, Ruth felt satisfaction rather than despair. Hazel grew stronger, her laughter filling the ranch house that had once echoed with loneliness. The townspeople remained wary at first, uncertain how to treat the widow who had humiliated their most powerful citizen and the Comanche warrior who stood beside her. But gradually, as they saw the ranch prospering, as they witnessed Ohiteka's quiet competence and unwavering protection of Ruth and Hazel, attitudes began to soften. Some would never accept them, clinging to old prejudices and resentments. But others began to nod in greeting when they passed, to trade fairly, to acknowledge that perhaps the world was more complicated than they had believed. 2 years passed. The drought finally broke, rains returning to transform the brown plains into seas of green. The ranch thrived under Ruth and Ohiteka's joint stewardship, becoming known for its quality cattle and fair dealings. Hazel grew into a bright, curious child who followed Ohiteka everywhere, learning to ride almost before she could walk, absorbing his teachings about the land and its rhythms. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple, Ruth and Ohiteka sat on the porch of the ranch house, watching Hazel chase fireflies in the yard. The child's laughter rang out, pure and joyful, and Ruth felt a contentment so deep it almost frightened her. She looked at Ohiteka, at the man who had saved her life and chosen to stay, and spoke softly. "Do you ever regret it, staying here, tying yourself to us?" Ohiteka turned to her, and in the fading light his scarred face looked younger, less burdened. "Every day," he said, "I wake expecting to feel the weight of old grief. And every day I find it a little lighter. You and Hazel have given me something I thought was lost forever. A reason to build rather than simply survive." "No, Ruth Mackenzie, I do not regret it." Ruth reached out and took his hand, their fingers intertwining naturally, comfortably. "Good," she said simply. "Because I cannot imagine this life without you in it." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell and the stars emerged, countless and eternal. Hazel eventually tired and came running to the porch, where Ohiteka scooped her up and carried her inside. The child's arms wrapped around his neck, her head resting on his shoulder. Ruth followed them inside, closing the door against the night, sealing in the warmth and light and love that filled this house built on the ruins of tragedy. She had lost much, survived more, and found in the end that salvation sometimes came from the most unexpected places. From a stranger who saw her when others looked away, who chose compassion over indifference, who proved that justice, though difficult and dangerous, was worth fighting for. And as she tucked Hazel into bed and watched Ohiteka stand guard by the window, his presence a shield against whatever darkness might come, Ruth understood that she had found something precious and rare, not just survival, but a life worth living, a future worth building, and a family forged not by blood, but by choice, courage, and the unbreakable bonds of shared struggle. The ranch was theirs now, truly and completely, and whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them together. 10 years had passed since the day Ruth Mackenzie stood in the town square of San Rafael and confronted Edgar Calloway. 10 years since a Comanche warrior named Ohiteka had chosen to stand beside a starving widow and her dying child. The Texas plains had witnessed much in that decade. Droughts and floods, births and deaths, the slow march of progress that brought railroads closer and pushed the old ways further into memory. But through it all, the Mackenzie Ranch had endured, had thrived, had become something more than land and cattle. It had become a testament to what could be built when courage met compassion. The ranch house had been rebuilt from its foundations, expanded to accommodate a growing household. What had once been a modest structure now boasted a second story, a wide wraparound porch and windows that caught the morning light and held it like captured gold. The corrals had been reinforced and multiplied, holding horses of exceptional quality that drew buyers from as far as Kansas City and Santa Fe. The cattle herds had grown to rival any in the territory, their brands recognized as marks of honest dealing and superior stock. But it was not the prosperity that made the ranch remarkable. It was the people who inhabited it, who had transformed it from a place of loss into a home of healing. Ruth stood now in the kitchen of that house, her hands deep in bread dough, working it with practiced efficiency. She was 34 years old, and the years had been kind in their way. The gauntness that had once defined her features had been replaced by healthy curves, her face fuller, her skin no longer stretched tight over bone. Grey had begun to thread through her auburn hair, but her eyes remained bright and clear, holding wisdom earned through suffering survived. She wore a simple cotton dress covered by an apron, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, flour dusting her forearms. Through the window above the wash basin, she could see Hazel in the yard. No longer a baby, but a girl of 11, tall for her age and strong, her auburn hair pulled back in a practical braid. She was working with one of the young horses, leading it in circles around the training pen, her movements confident and sure. Beside her walked Ohiteka, his massive frame only slightly diminished by age, his hair now heavily streaked with silver, but his bearing still that of a warrior. He spoke to Hazel in low tones, offering guidance, and the girl listened with the intense focus she brought to everything he taught her. Ruth smiled as she watched them, her heart swelling with an emotion that had become familiar over the years, but never lost its power. Love, yes, but also gratitude and wonder at the strange paths life could take, at how what seemed like an ending could transform into a beginning. The sound of wagons approaching drew her attention. She wiped her hands on her apron and moved to the front window, pulling aside the curtain to see who was arriving. A buckboard pulled by two sturdy horses came up the drive, and on the seat sat Thomas Whitmore, now well into his 60s, his face weathered but content. Beside him sat his wife Clara, a woman he had married 3 years ago after a lifetime of bachelorhood, finding love in unexpected places just as Ruth had. Ruth moved to the door and opened it, stepping onto the porch as the wagon came to a halt. "Thomas, Clara, welcome. We were not expecting you until later, but I'm glad you arrived early." Thomas climbed down with the careful movements of aging joints and helped his wife descend before turning to Ruth with a smile that creased his face into a map of well-worn lines. "We finished our business in town early and thought we might arrive ahead of the crowd. Give us a chance to catch up proper before things get hectic." Clara embraced Ruth warmly, the two women having developed a close friendship over the years. "I brought my apple preserves, 3 jars. And Thomas insisted on bringing that fiddle of his, though I warned him, his playing has not improved with age." Thomas laughed, the sound rich and genuine. "My playing is fine. It is everyone else's hearing that has gotten worse." They moved into the house, carrying their contributions for the day's celebration. Once a year, Ruth and Ohiteka hosted a gathering at the ranch, inviting all those who had stood with them that day in San Rafael, along with new friends made in the years since. It had started small, just Thomas and Maria Santos and Peter Chen, but had grown as the ranch's reputation spread, as others who had been helped by Ruth and Ohiteka's generosity wanted to pay their respects. Maria Santos arrived next, no longer dressed in widow's black, but in a dress of deep green that complemented her still dark hair. She had remarried 2 years ago to a merchant from San Antonio, a kind man who treated her with respect and gentleness. She brought her husband, Carlos, and their infant son, a child who represented hope renewed. Ruth embraced her old friend fiercely, remembering the shared pain that had first brought them together. Peter Chen came alone, as was his custom. He had risen to become the head clerk at the land office, his integrity earning him respect throughout the territory. He had never married, dedicating himself instead to ensuring that the corruption that had once plagued property transactions could never take root again. He brought with him a ledger, a gift for Hazel, who had shown an aptitude for numbers and record-keeping that delighted him. As the afternoon progressed, more arrived. Ranch hands who worked the Mackenzie spread, their families in tow. Neighbors from surrounding properties who had learned that Ruth and Ohiteka could be counted on in times of trouble. Even Sheriff Beckett made the journey, now retired, but still carrying himself with the dignity of a man who had finally chosen to do right after years of looking away. The house filled with voices and laughter, children running through the yard, men gathering near the barn to talk of cattle and weather. Women congregating in the kitchen to prepare the feast that would be served that evening. Ruth moved among them all, ensuring everyone felt welcome, that food and drink were plentiful, that the space she and Ohiteka had created remained open to all who came with honest hearts. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, the group gathered outside, where long tables had been set up beneath the cottonwood trees that bordered the main house. The tables groaned under the weight of food, roasted beef and chicken, fresh bread and butter, vegetables from the ranch garden, pies and cakes and preserves. It was a feast that spoke of abundance, earned through hard work and shared generously. Before they ate, Ruth stood and raised her hand for silence. The gathered crowd quieted, turning their attention to her. She felt Ohiteka's presence behind her, solid and reassuring, and drew strength from it as she always had. 10 years ago, Ruth began, her voice carrying clearly in the evening air. I stood in the town square with my starving daughter in my arms, certain that we would not survive another day. I had been cast out, rejected, left to die by people who should have shown mercy. I had lost everything except the will to keep breathing for one more hour, to see my child through one more night. She paused, emotion threatening to overwhelm her, then continued. And then a stranger appeared, a man who had every reason to hate my people, to walk past my suffering as so many others had done. Instead, he stopped. He saw us, he helped us. And in doing so, he changed not just our lives, but the lives of everyone gathered here. She turned to look at Ohiteka, who stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable, but his eyes warm. This ranch, this home, this community we have built, it exists because one man chose compassion over indifference. Because he showed us that justice is not something handed down by courts and laws alone, but something we create through our actions, our choices, our willingness to stand against cruelty even when it costs us. The crowd murmured agreement, and Ruth saw many nodding, remembering their own stories of how the ranch had touched their lives. She raised her cup, filled with cool well water, and spoke the words that had become tradition at these gatherings. To Ohiteka, who taught us that family is not defined by blood, but by loyalty. To courage in the face of power. To truth spoken loudly enough to shatter lies. And to the knowledge that we are never truly alone if we have the courage to reach out and the wisdom to accept help when it is offered. To Ohiteka, the crowd echoed, raising their own cups and glasses. Ohiteka, uncomfortable as always with being the center of attention, gave a slight nod of acknowledgement but said nothing. He had never been a man of many words, preferring to let his actions speak for him. But Ruth saw the emotion in his eyes, the gratitude and belonging that he had found here among people who judged him not by his heritage, but by his character. The meal that followed was boisterous and joyful, filled with conversation and laughter. Children played tag among the trees, while adults shared stories and caught up on the year's events. Thomas Whitmore did indeed bring out his fiddle after the meal, and though his playing was somewhat rusty, it was enthusiastic. And soon couples were dancing on the packed earth between the tables. Ruth found herself swept into a dance by Carlos Santos, Maria's husband, who proved surprisingly light on his feet. As they spun past the other dancers, Ruth caught sight of Ohiteka standing at the edge of the circle, watching with an expression that might have been amusement. Hazel had dragged him there, the girl pulling on his hand with determination, clearly intent on making him join the festivities. As the song ended and Ruth curtsied to her partner, Hazel succeeded in her mission. The girl pushed Ohiteka toward her mother with both hands, her face lit with mischief. "Your turn," she announced. "Mama, make him dance. He says he does not know how, but I do not believe him." The crowd had noticed and was watching with interest. Ruth felt her cheeks flush, but extended her hand to Ohiteka nonetheless. "One dance," she said softly. "It will not kill you." Ohiteka looked down at her outstretched hand, then at the expectant faces surrounding them. For a moment, Ruth thought he would refuse, would retreat to his customary position at the margins. But then slowly he took her hand. His palm was warm and calloused against hers, familiar after years of working side by side. Thomas struck up a slower tune, something gentle and waltz-like. Ohiteka placed his other hand carefully at Ruth's waist, and they began to move. He was not graceful, his movements too measured, too controlled, but he was not clumsy either. They swayed together to the music, and Ruth found herself acutely aware of his nearness, of the strength in his frame, of the way his eyes never left her face. "You have gotten better at this," she said quietly, for his ears alone. "I remember the first time I tried to teach you. You nearly stepped on my feet a dozen times. That was 8 years ago." Ohiteka replied, his voice rumbling low. "I'm a slow learner, but I am persistent." Ruth smiled. "You have been more than persistent. You have been everything. Partner, protector, friend. Father to my daughter in all the ways that matter." Ohiteka's hand tightened slightly at her waist. "She has been the child I thought I would never have again. And you," he paused, struggling with words, as he always did when emotions ran deep. "You have been the home I did not know I was searching for." The music ended, but they stood for a moment longer, hands still clasped, the space between them charged with things unspoken, but deeply understood. Then Hazel was there, throwing her arms around both of them, and the moment transformed from intimate to familial, the three of them embracing as the crowd applauded. As night fell and guests began departing with promises to return next year, Ruth stood at the gate with Ohiteka waving farewell. Hazel had fallen asleep on the porch, exhausted from the excitement, and would need to be carried to bed. But for now, Ruth allowed herself a moment to simply stand beside the man who had changed her life. "Do you ever think about that day?" she asked quietly. "The day you first saw me in San Rafael, trying to sell my wedding ring." Ohiteka was silent for a long moment. "Every day," he said finally. "I think about how close I came to riding past. I was on my way north, had no intention of stopping in that town. But something made me pause. Perhaps it was fate. Perhaps it was the memory of my own wife and child, my own loss. Whatever it was, I am grateful for it." "So am I," Ruth whispered. "More grateful than I can ever express." They stood together as the night deepened, the stars emerging in their thousands, bright and cold and eternal. Somewhere in the distance a coyote howled, its voice rising and falling like a song of the wild places. The sound made Ruth shiver, but not with fear. Ohiteka placed his hand on her shoulder. "We have built something strong here, Ruth, something that will last beyond us. Hazel will inherit not just land and cattle, but the knowledge that courage and compassion matter, that justice is worth fighting for, that family is what we make it." Ruth covered his hand with hers. "That is your legacy as much as mine. You have given her a father's love, taught her skills that will serve her all her life, shown her that people are defined by their actions, not their ancestry. She is a remarkable child, because she learned from a remarkable man." They remained there until the ranch settled into the deep quiet of night. Then together they walked back to the house where their daughter slept, where a fire burned low in the hearth, where a life they had built against all odds waited to embrace them. Inside, Ruth covered Hazel with a blanket and kissed her forehead, marveling at how much the child had grown. Ohiteka stood by the window, gazing out into the darkness. "You can rest," Ruth said softly. "The battles are over. We are safe now. A warrior never truly rests, Ohiteka replied. But I am content. More content than I ever thought possible. Ruth leaned her head against his shoulder, and he wrapped an arm around her. They stood that way for a long time. Two souls who had found each other in the darkest of circumstances and had built a light strong enough to guide others home. The years ahead would bring challenges. Hazel would grow and forge her own path. The ranch would face storms and changing times, but they would face it all together, with courage and the unshakable knowledge that they had already survived the worst. And in surviving, they had done more than endure. They had lived, they had loved, they had created something beautiful from despair, and that was everything. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.